Welcome to our monthly Work First Discovering Employment webinar series. My name is John Adams. I'm the Employment and Training Manager at CDERP. Today, our Director, Dr. Peter Smith, will share an overview of inclusive corporations, including our research and how we can enable companies to employ people with disabilities through inclusive policies and practices. During the webinar, please pop your questions in the chat area on the right-hand side, and I will ask Peter these questions following his presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Peter, who is the founder of the Centre for Disability Employment Research and Practice. Peter is a visiting fellow at Cornell University and a fellow at University of Melbourne School of Social and Political Sciences. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, John. I have to apologise. My glasses, the widescreen, it flares, so I apologise if I look like I've got two TV screens for eyes. What I wanted to do today was give you an overview of our Work First program, in particular a focus on the corporate program, and towards the end I'll extend it a little further and give you an idea about the individual component of it as well. So the Work First program had its genesis with a provider in Western Australia last year. The provider, in this particular case, Interlife in Perth, are an ADE that operate commercial services for large corporations in Perth, in the CBD and surrounds. And they'd approached me and said, look, we provide services to organisations. At the same time, we talk to them about employing the staff rather than hiring them from us or hiring a service from us to employ them. And what they found is something that still fascinates me to this day. And that was that employers would say to them, we'd love to employ someone with disability, but we don't know how to. And we're not talking about small employers. We're talking about billion-dollar entities in the mining industry and construction industry that are based in Perth. Many of them are global entities. So it's a really fascinating one to see a large corporation say that, particularly when most large corporations have diversity and inclusion policies. So it has an interesting starting point. So what we did was we sat down and we had a look at okay, if this is the issue large corporations are having, how do we address that? And if you look around the community globally, what you see is there is a lot of programs around that create awareness inside large corporations that address issues around educating them around disability and get them ratings and say they're disability friendly employers and all this sort of stuff. And that's fine in itself. But the question, of course, is why don't we see significant levels of employment? And what we find is that a lot of these programs, they measure and help an organisation change its practices, but they don't necessarily support the other side of it. So in other words, they talk to them about the demand side, but they don't actually marry up the supply. So what we did was we looked at a number of the measures that were available in the community and went, okay, if this is what we're measuring, this is the starting point, because there's that old adage, what gets measured gets done. So that's where our starting point. We did a fair bit of research around this, and as I've said here, it wasn't about trying to get people to employ a person with a disability because they wanted to do that. We wanted to look at the research around supply and demand and how that can be married up in a way that created seamless opportunities for people with disabilities to have meaningful employment and also careers, and that's a real key thing for us. So fortunately, at the time when I was approached, I was actually working in America at Cornell, and I was able to have a look inside some of the very best measures they have in the States around inclusive corporations, because the US is a long way ahead of us when it comes to the large corporations and inclusion. So being able to look at the research inside and go from there as a way of developing a program that we could use in Australia, or more importantly, that we could pilot in Australia in Perth through Interlife. So as I've said there, it's not simply about recruitment. It's about we're trying to understand an organisation and create change at all levels so that it supports the natural recruitment and delivery of careers and employment. And that to us is the key. How do we get supply and demand to marry up in a seamless way? And one of the ways that we looked at this, and certainly some of the evidence, it pointed to the idea of embedding the employment people in the organisation. Now, we've seen a little bit of that in Australia over the years, and it's been very successful, but it's not a norm, and we haven't seen it break out in any large way within large corporations. So what we did was, part of the logic behind this is there's a lot of research evidence around that talks about things such as this, talks about this focus that we've had at a government and a variety of levels around, developing highly skilled, highly educated workforce for the future, because the future of work is a discussion, and they're kind of focused on that. But what we've seen globally is there's a shortfall of mid-skilled workers. And this piece of research that I was looking at in the States, it illustrated that 54% of employers are unable to find sufficient recruits for those mid-skilled roles. And if you think about it, these are the sort of roles that would be easily filled by people with a disability with the right supports. And in many ways, these are roles that would elevate the employment proposition for people with a disability above what we would commonly see as so we say, low-skilled roles. So there's a huge opportunity there to an untapped market to have a look at. So we started to look at that. And, there's lots of research around. Fong Chan's research, his most recent paper last year, confirmed some of his earlier research, which simply illustrated that HR and hiring managers, they're not that enthusiastic. There's a lot of talk, but they're not. But just like the employment process itself, particularly discovery, customised employment, it doesn't embed itself in a provider unless management have an absolute buy-in. And this is what we see also in large corporations. The senior manager needs to be focused on changing policies, changing the efforts, and bringing in the training into the employment equation around disability and employment in general, along with a knowledge of job accommodation. Because I'm sure if in your work, you've probably seen people talk about accommodations, and it tends to scare them because they think it's an expensive proposition. But interestingly enough, what we've found over the years is that accommodations generally are not that expensive. There's a lot of research that highlights that the general accommodation cost is about $300 for a person. That's not a huge amount of money. So it starts to raise the question of, okay, if accommodations are scary, why? And some of it has to do with, in my view, is an absence of understanding around disability and people with a disability in general. So in the research, it highlighted effectively there were six pillars, what we call 6 pillars, or the 6 areas where you need to address in order to make employment in large organisations, and clearly in small organisations as well, to make that the norm rather than the occasional thing that happens. So these pillars largely fall under the headings of understanding disability, the recruitment and hiring skills for diversity, skills around career development and staff retention, accessibility and accommodation, understanding compensation and benefit, and post-hiring supports. And collectively, they're very important. And, if you think about a lot of employment processes where employment fails, it tends to fail in the post-placement or post-support area. And it also tends to fail in the recruitment area, because often the recruitment area itself isn't particularly friendly to people with a disability. I don't know about you, but I actually find recruitment places, when I say places, I mean the ads and the processes, to actually be quite intimidating. A lot of ads, for instance, don't make sense to me. And in my own work, working with people with disability, supporting them into employment, I've often found that the recruitment process, whilst it appears open, if there's any mention of disability, it closes straight away. So we've got to change those type of attitudes. So what we did was we looked at those 6 points, and we did the research around. We did a fair bit of research, breaking that down into individual factors. And what we were able to do was we're able to settle on 42 elements that are known factors that underpin successful disability employment. And what we found was that as part of the process of doing this work, is that we go and review an organisation. We go and look at all their practices, these 47 elements, and some of them are well known to us. There are things like, is there job shadowing available? Are there training methodologies that accommodate people with disabilities? If there are things like the job descriptions, do they make sense? Are they task and skill specific? And, to give you an example, one of the things that we do in this process is that often job descriptions are very different from what happens. And particularly the more distance you put between the head office and where the task is going to happen, you generally find the job descriptions are kind of the same but somewhat vague. So one of the things that we do as part of this process is that we look at the job description and then we go and look at the job happening to make sure that that job is exactly as it's described, if the skills are described, etc., so that it marries up properly, because often you'll find job descriptions and job practices don't actually match up terribly well. So these are some of the things that we do as part of the process. We look at things like whether there's a staff really understand the notion of disability. Now, these factors, whilst you might look at it and go, this is a lot of work to do for an organisation, this auditing of the organisation across these domains and these elements, which take place generally on premises, generally through discussions, and also going out and reviewing the organisation. Clearly this year has been problematic because we haven't been able to travel, so some of the programs have been working on are currently sitting on a hold waiting for us to be able to travel again, but that's fine. That's just the nature of 2020 for us. But one of the interesting things we found in this particular process was that organisations wanted a rating. I'm not a fan of ratings, so what we did was we developed a rating, or rather a measure, a benchmark, so the organisation could benchmark it against itself. There's no point in benchmarking, for instance, an engineering organisation against an organisation that, for instance, simply does work in offices. They're two different beasts, and how that might operate over there will not be the way it operates over there. So the benchmark is actually a benchmark against the elements, but you're only benchmarked against yourself. So when you look at this, when we point out the deficits in your practices, what we have to do is improve them so you get better than where you were, rather than comparing you against another company. That creates perversions in rating. So it's not how this particular process works. So what we were trying to do is we were trying to work with the organisation to develop inclusive policies and practices, along with getting key staff to join in a professional development program. So what we did was we developed a program that goes along with with the Work First corporate program, where it trains staff and it educates them. And it educates them in areas like disability. There's a bit of a belief that everybody knows what a disability is, but what we generally find is that people's experience of disability will either be someone they know, a friend of someone they know, or confined to the images you tend to see, such as people in wheelchairs, people with Down syndrome, people with cerebral palsy, people with autism, etc., etc. So the definitions or their understanding of disability is somewhat limited. So we take them through an extensive program that trains them in disability, that reviews their policies and changes their policies so they reflect best practice. But one of the important things, and one of the key things from my perspective, is that we take them through the recruitment process that the providers use so they understand how that works. Because part of this process for us, if you look at it from our perspective, is we're creating a partnership between the provider and the employer. So we want the employer to understand the processes the provider uses to identify a worker that's suitable for a role or a career in that organisation that they put forward to fill a vacant position. By educating the employer on that process, they have confidence that when the provider places someone in front of them and says, this is the candidate, the ideal candidate for this role, then they have trust that in the process and the provider, and it starts to short circuit some of the doubt over whether this is the right person or not. What we've been able to do in the pilot so far, and the providers we've been working with, the provider and the employers we've been working with, is this partnership sees the disability employment staff become part of the organisation in the sense that they become part of the recruitment process. And part of that process is really important. Well, it's all important, but one of the key things for us, of course, is that we need the organisation to develop an understanding around disability so that the notion of workplace supports or natural supports in the workplace is a given, that everybody has the capacity to become a workplace support, because clearly as a service provider, you don't want your staff there forever supporting someone. The best outcome is for you to support the right individual into the organisation, have the natural supports created, and then you step away so that the natural supports take over, because then you have the employer, you have the natural support, and you have the employee that you've introduced to the organisation. That's who the relationship should be with. If you've got an outside person, such as someone else delivering the support, when does the individual have the opportunity to become a part of the workforce without someone sort of standing there, sort of helping them? So for us, it's about supporting the right candidate in the workplace as the natural supports develop and then fade out. So it's the right candidate at the right time with the right supports. And it's really quite fascinating, the development of natural supports, because part of that process is around also identifying who's the go-to person. Who does everybody go to when they have a problem? That person generally ends up being the natural support, because they're a natural at supporting and teaching people and helping them learn processes in the organisation. So one of the things that we do as part of this process is that we don't leave the organisation alone, in the sense that we work with them, and in some organisations we've actually done the work in writing the new policies for them and the procedures to assist them. Some organisations are quite happy for us to work with them and assist their staff to do it. That's fine. It's flexible enough that we'll work with the employer any way they want. Then we come back and we have a look, because clearly once these processes are happening in the organisation, we want to come back in a couple of months' time and see what's going on. So we come back after 6 months and we review it, the processes and the practices, to see if they're working. And then what we've been finding is that the employers we've started with have simply said, we'd like you to come back on a regular basis, and generally about a yearly basis to come back. And the first ones will be happening next year, of course, where we'll come back and we'll just have a look and see what's going on and do any fine tuning. But the perfect outcome, of course, is that the provider is there, their staff are going in and out, they're providing suitable candidates inside the organisation. And these are all, we're doing this on the basis of award paying wages. In other words, if that person gets employed by that organisation, they're employed on the same wage. And we've seen some really good examples of that. So that's what we're trying to do with the corporate program. You know, it's really quite fascinating, and this is a really interesting piece of research the Kessler Foundation produced. It was, obviously 3 years ago now, or just on 3 years ago. They found that most employers have effective programs for accommodating workers with disability, but they overlook the recruiting and training practices that would expand the opportunities. So it's really quite fascinating, because to see quotes like, many times employers don't know where to find qualified candidates, that still fascinates me, of all the awareness programs that have existed for years. We're currently working with an organisation that's number 4 in its field globally, that everybody would know about. You see their ads on TV, and we're working with them to change their processes in Australia, so that they can start to recruit and provide opportunities for people with disabilities in their field. So it's been a fascinating journey creating the corporate program around Work First. And what's come out of that, of course, is that because we've been working with large organisations, periodically what started to happen was that we started to see individuals approach us to support them in employment. And this is something that in the past we've pointed people in the direction of certain clients, but clearly this year has forced a bit of a pivot on every organisation. So one of the things that we've started doing just recently is we've actually started delivering employment services to individuals under the Work First banner. Our program is being supported by the NDIS, so we have literally weekly conversations with them. We're testing customised employment in its purest form within the NDIS model. And if you wanted to know more about that, by all means talk to John Adams. John's running that program, and we're having very good success with individuals. We're working with kids as young as 13. So that to us feeds into the evidence base as well. So we're able to work on the corporate area and change the recruitment processes and the knowledge base there. And at the same time, we're also working with individuals as well. So hopefully we'll be able to marry up the supply and demand. But of course, the Work First corporate program is about working with providers in different parts of Australia as well as overseas. It's not necessarily simply a program that we provide all the employment opportunities. Like I said, this program came out of Interlife in Perth, who actually provided the funding to develop this program. And it started to have some very good success, of course, before the walls went up in Australia and COVID closed everything down. So we've done a lot of the work remotely, but there's a lot of work we'd like to do that we have to do face-to-face, which we can't do at the moment. But clearly, as we're slowly being able to move around, we'll get back to that. As a matter of fact, we have a meeting next week, a Zoom meeting with Interlife and the clients in Western Australia to start to talk about how we get going again now that we're slowly able to move around. And I can tell you, as soon as the borders drop in Western Australia, we'll be over there to continue the rollout of the program. One of the interesting developments in the corporate program in Western Australia is one organisation we're working with is actually the Australian arm of a global multinational, and they've asked us to look at the program for them internationally. So we've sort of slowed the Western Australian version down a little bit while we reorientated to a global perspective for them. So we think it's the right idea. It's certainly getting traction. It's evidence-based, and I don't think anybody can argue with the idea of marrying up supply and demand. I think if we can marry up supply and demand in a seamless way, then clearly we're going to improve outcomes and opportunities. They're there, and with the focus on developing people at a higher level, leaving that void in the middle, I think there's great opportunities for us to expand into to more higher skilled jobs within the corporate community, something that hasn't really been done to any great degree. But it is about a partnership. It's not simply about saying, okay, guess what, you're a disability friendly organisation. That's not going to get someone a job. We really need to continue to push to embed providers into large employers by being a service, a value-added service for them. So that's an overview of it. As I've said, it's about individual organisational capabilities. It's about improving the organisational capabilities so they can provide opportunities for people with disability, have meaningful careers and employment. That affords mutuality, and mutuality really is the key to this process. Okay, so I think I'm at a point where we can have questions. Thank you for the 25, 30 minutes that I brushed through it. My apologies if I brushed through it a little bit quickly. Despite doing dozens of these, anxiety always gets the better of me. So if you have any questions, let's see if we can answer them for you. John?
Thanks, Peter. Just waiting for some of the questions to come through. I've got a couple to...
up there, John.
Okay, sorry about that. We're just waiting for the questions to come through the chat area. I've got some to kick us off while we wait. I've just got a message here from Kathy. She's asking, do you have partner organisations in Sydney?
The answer to the question is no at the moment. So by all means, ring me. Been an interesting year with this program because, because of COVID, it's changed a whole lot of things, and certainly the way we can operate, because clearly from March this year, if you're in Victoria, you weren't able to leave your house literally. That's provided some challenges. And certainly working remotely, I guess in theory we should be used to it. But I don't know about you, but after thousands of Zoom meetings and lectures, etc., I'm actually ready to get out and see people, even though I'm terrified of going outside now. Thank you, COVID. I do look forward to getting out and working with organisations and providers again.
And Peter, you touched on mutuality there at the end. Can you provide a bit more detail for our audience?
Yeah, mutuality is really quite a simple concept, in the sense that the only reason anybody employs anybody is if they have an exploitable skill that you can profit from. And that might sound harsh, but the reality is that when you look at providers today, they're not interested in fluffy reasons to employ someone with a disability. They want something that you've got that they can make money out of. And mutuality is about looking at the capability of the individual and seeing how that can be monetized by the employer. So what happens is the employer gets the opportunity to make profit by employing you, and you in turn get the opportunity to have a career, have employment, and use your skills in a truly inclusive way, not simply in a, shall we say, a protected environment, but out in the real world, working for a real wage, just like everybody else, because that's what employment is all about. It's not about hibernating people in protected environments. And yes, there are people that need a little bit more of an environment that's a bit friendly, but at the end of the day, most employment, open employment, is out there, and mutuality is that trading of what you have for what they want, where you both win.
Great. Peter, why do you think disability awareness programs in the past have failed to really shift employment outcomes?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a discussion with my friend Rich Luking, who he wrote a paper a couple of years ago, or a piece, which I think was published here in Victoria. And he said, we've been doing disability awareness programs for decades. Nothing's changed. Everybody is aware of disability. And I think that, when you see large corporations say, oh, we don't know how to do this, and that same large corporation has a diversity department, you scratch your head and you go, well, hang on, you've got a diversity department, but you're saying you don't know how to employ people with a disability. And I think we've done a very good job of convincing employers not to employ people, because it's kind of difficult and there are things that might happen. But some of that simply comes because we've done a really good job of convincing people you should employ people with a disability, and we've highlighted the disabilities. We actually haven't shown them a way to do it. And I think what we're trying to do first is actually take all that fear away through education and providing a service inside the organisation, so you become their de facto disability diversity arm. And if we can do that, then all of a sudden it's not going to take long before they go, you know what, this isn't as hard as we thought. I mean, I've had one large organisation, a $5 billion organisation in Australia, ask me that, when you worked out how to employ, how we can employ people with a disability, and this is the diversity officer asking me this, can we work out how it could work with Indigenous people? Now I scratch my head and go, what have we done here to the message? And I think disability awareness is no longer the message we need to be doing. We have to get away from employ people with disability because they're more reliable, they have less sick days, all these warm fuzzy things. And I'll admit, I'm not a fan of any of those warm fuzzy things. In a previous life, I was the GM of a merchant bank, and quite frankly, the only reason to employ anybody is because I can make money out of you. It's the only reason any of us have a job. No one employs us because we look good, because otherwise I'd be unemployed. I'm not that good looking.
But you're the boss, Peter.
Well, I think you're unemployed then.
We've got a few questions coming through. So Josie has asked, have you had more success with larger organisation? In other words, does size matter?
Look, I don't think size matters. I think where it happens is that when you work with larger organisations, they have structures in place where they've already recognised that, okay, we have to employ someone with a disability or diversity. And you see that with organisations that deal with government, where if you have if you're working with a government in a government program, there are disability targets, and we have an organisation at the moment, a Swiss organisation, who's one of the leaders in its field globally, who are about to spend $250 million here in Melbourne. They've already started the process. They're partnering with, they have an Australian partner, and the Victorian government are providing them with the real estate to build their particular operation. They approached us and earlier this year and asked us to partner in that. And they've simply said, great, you're it. We want you to look after the disability recruitment side of it and help us with that. And by the way, our target is 125 people with disability. So I think that what we find of large corporations is that they can be more, if you give them the right support, they're easier to work with. Having said that, I worked with a lot of small organisations where they don't have a problem with it. For them, it's more around the financial side of it. So it's a different process. There's one organisation that we've just started working with. It's an American group. They have 135 staff in their diversity office. And they've asked us to help them do their work in Australia. I scratch my head and go, if you've got 135 people in your diversity office, then you shouldn't need anybody's help. But clearly, we've missed something in the translation between diversity and inclusion and people with a disability.
Peter, Nikki's asked, is there disability awareness programs available to strengthen employment coaches, mentors' knowledge? Is it or can it be included in the CDERP training?
Well, John could include that in there. There's no doubt that that can be part and parcel of it. But at the moment, weirdly enough, I'm actually writing a program that's going to assist the NDIS around educating them, believe it or not, around employment and disability. But what we'll probably do at some point is the program that we're about to bring online for the large corporations, we'll probably make that available to the public as well. So that it's coming, but with only 2 months between now and Christmas, we will run out of time this year, for certain.
And Kathy's asked, my 20-year-old son with an intellectual disability has had 2 years of cafe work experience. I'd like to explore new employment opportunities for him, but am unsure of where to start. I'd like to go through the discovery process with him. Okay,
what I'd like you to do is have a talk to John. John's contact details are on our website. John looks after the individual employment, and he'll be able to answer those questions for you, Kathy, and certainly assist you with that. It's been quite interesting the last couple of months with the larger program and now the individual program. We're now working with a number of schools. We were approached by another school today to work with them around employment programs for their students, and we're starting to see more and more of that, which we think is refreshing because it tells us that people are starting to take this seriously.
Just a couple of comments. Nikki said, thank you, that would be fabulous. Kathy said, all good.
I still apologise because when I look up, the whiteness of the screens turns my glasses into 2 television screens.
Peter, you talked about our valued added services in terms of creating that connection between disability organisations and people with a disability with the large employers. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how that would work?
Yeah, what we've done, and certainly the programs that we started in Western Australia, by bringing the provider organisation into the organisation so that they start to hold their recruitment staff's hands, and then by going into the field and holding their staff's hands and educating them around disability so that they get comfortable with the idea of being someone's natural support, you start to open up a conversation. And what we see happening after a short period of time is you start to see people in the organisation take charge of it. and they become the peer mentors to other people in the organisation. So all of a sudden, it takes away that fear that this is something different, something, I mean, there is one of the commonest things I find is that, we don't want to do that because it might hurt them or something like that. It's almost that fear that you might break someone with a disability. Well, I mean, I've got grandkids and kids with disabilities, and I can tell you, they're probably stronger than I am. I mean, breaking someone is not something we need to be concerned about. So, look, I think that, and I know I'm being a little bit flippant there, but by marrying them together, you take away that concern they might have that, what happens if I do something wrong? The truth is, you're not going to do anything wrong, because doing something wrong is how you learn. And what we find by having the provider staff engage with the employer staff, they become their own peer network. And then because the provider has the relationship with the family and the individual, well, all of a sudden you end up with a really great relationship where if it's mum and dad are involved, they can step back because they have confidence in the employer, confidence in the provider. And often that's been one of the things, is that families are reluctant to trust providers and reluctant to trust employers. So by having them as part of this education process, you start to build trust. And we know that trust is the number one ingredient in long-term meaningful careers and employment. Hopefully that's answered without going in a different direction.
Great. Just waiting for some more questions to come through. I've also shared a couple of files in the file section. So if you'd like to read more about the Inclusive Corporations program, do you want to tell us a little bit about those resources, Peter?
Yeah, there is the Workforce Corporate Brochure simply highlights the program itself and what we go through, the 4 stages. Have a look at that. It's actually quite a really, from my point of view, it's an interesting program. But certainly what we found with organisations when we've gone through the process, particularly the review and audit process, is they love the fact that it's highlighted so many missing elements in their organisation. I had one large corporation say to me, "I reckon you'll find we have nothing because we suck at this," which is fascinating coming from the CEO of an organisation that has an enterprise value of about $50 billion to say that they suck at it. But it does illustrate that he was angry about it and they wanted to do something about it. So, from my perspective, I've forgotten where I was going with that. You might have to remind me, John. The brochure, the brochure highlights some of those areas and how we do it. In some ways, it might also summarise what some of the slides today, but it does illustrate that it's a 4-stage process, and even the stages themselves, once we get inside the organisation, whilst it illustrates there are 4 stages, internally there are more stages that we do with the organisation, because clearly there's some contextualisation in some organisations.
Great. We've got another question come through. How do you find that the work first process is received by existing disability employment service providers?
Well, we only work with a handful of service providers. We do that purposely, and we do that simply because one of the things that the NDIS has taught us is that we need a new paradigm. And if people are simply trying to repeat what they've done for the last 10, 20, 30 years, then nothing's going to change very much. So we've purposely gone out and worked with providers that are trying to do innovative things. If they're simply trying to dress up what they used to do and continue doing what we've done in the past, clearly if employment rates haven't changed, then why would you want to repeat what we've been doing? So we're fortunate that providers that we are working with are providers that are going in a different direction, that recognise that they need to be more innovative, they need to be more in tune with what their clients want. And that's part of the logic behind the Work First Individual Employment Program. One of the things we pop up against regularly is providers will say, "Oh, we can't make money delivering employment in the NDIS." And we go, "Well, you can, but you can't do it with your old legacy model." And that's true of any service provision within, that existed prior to the NDIS. If you're simply trying to fit the NDIS into your old ways of operating, then clearly it's not going to succeed. But the Work First Individual program and even the mental health service that's attached to it, they're about illustrating what you can do profitably within the NDIS framework and deliver employment services within the customised employment methodology, and do it well and do it with complete fidelity to the model. And that's the key. And it's part of the driver behind starting the employment services, to illustrate to people, this is the model, this is how it works, and to also gather evidence and build the evidence base, because the origins of the centre was about improving and building the evidence base with disability employment, both at a policy and practice level, and that's what we do. And we do it by going out there and physically engaging with people with a disability in the employment process, organisations, providers, government, and academics, even though I'm going to sit here and argue that I'm not an academic. I'm not, even though, weirdly enough, I seem to be attached to universities these days, but that's not my background. I'm initially a support worker. So even though John and Lauren and everybody keeps me away from people these days and lock me up and make me right, I still try to get my hands dirty.
Peter Michaels asked, what mid-skilled occupations do you think should be targeted?
Look, I think that, when you start to think about what mid-skilled occupations, I think if you look at the traditional ways that we've gone around employment, which has always been about the idea of entry-level jobs. When I look at mid-skilled jobs these days, I look at those sort of roles that are potentially at supervisor level, potentially and also I think part of this for me is driven by the fact that large organisations are no longer looking at the qualifications a person has. They're looking at the skills they have and where they fit in that organisation. So there are opportunities to do things that, for instance, working with machinery, which might sound odd, but a lot of organisations these days, the organisation that I'm referring to with the 120 odd staff demand, most of those organisations will be around using machinery, but that machinery is controlled by computers and programs. So that's the sort of stuff that is not difficult to using systematic instruction help someone acquire the skills to do that. So I think that I'm not going to pigeonhole it and say, oh, look here, but you know what? I don't want to see anybody anymore where the entry point is cleaning the tables at McDonald's and the exit point 20 years later is doing the same thing. If that's your choice, that's fine, but it shouldn't be the norm. If someone can clean the tables, they can manage someone else cleaning the tables. So why aren't they the manager? That to me is a mid-skill level job. It involves organising people, managing people. Why couldn't they do that? And I know I went back to restaurants, probably because I went to a restaurant last night for the first time all this year. But, it's that higher level, shall we say, semi-technical jobs. If you look at the discovery process, one of the outcomes of that is training and a vocational pathway. So you can look at vocational pathways, but we need to elevate above the basic skill level roles.
Peter, we've got a few members of our CDERP college here today, and I'm just wondering if you could share how, as the Work First Inclusive Corporations program grows and develops, how that might overlap with the CDERP certified customised employment professionals.
Look, I haven't given it a lot of thought, but what I would suggest to you is that depending where you are, and I think Nikki's online there, knowing the location where you are, there'd be no reason why we couldn't take the program into your region and work with you there. That's not a difficult proposition. I would see that almost as a normative, because even though, the program has its origins in working with some large providers, I actually think the future of disability employment is with smaller niche providers that understand their community and working at that more personal level. And Work First is an opportunity to also work with organisations and provide them with education. I would see that over time there'll be a modification or a version of this that's sort of aimed at organisations that don't have the large corporations that have their diversity and inclusion departments. Well, what happens to the small to medium organisation where they don't have a HR person, or maybe they have one person, it's the accountant who also does the hiring and firing. So why couldn't we use this same program with them to educate them and be their de facto HR department? Because if you could do that, for instance, Nikki, I'm sorry if I address you by name, but why wouldn't you also think about, okay, if this is about hiring people with disabilities and finding employment for someone with a disability, there are also going to be employment opportunities that maybe you might go, well, maybe this isn't the right job for someone with a disability. Maybe I'll help you with the recruitment there. So it's about using work first to add value to the organisation you're working with. That's kind of basically taking the micro enterprise approach and turning yourself into one.
Great. We don't have any more questions. Oh, here's one coming through. Nikki, I'm slowly having discussions with employers and employer groups within my area regarding inclusive employment.
Nikki, what I'd suggest is shoot me an email, and John and I will set up a time and we'll get together with you on Zoom, and we can have another conversation with you.
Now, Peter, did you want to mention anything else about our CDERP college or other programs?
No, John, I'm happy for you to talk about that as you run the college and the programs. One of the things we're doing at the college is clearly with COVID, we're running out of time this year, but we have a number of programs that have been designed in response to the demand that's come to us, but clearly trying to get everything done, and we face the dilemma, of course, that in 6 weeks it's the middle of December and most of this country closes down. But so we're working on some new programs. There are some new programs coming that will add more to it, such as the program that sits within Work First for the corporates. There is another CE program coming, which is aimed at the higher level. There is a program that we're writing at the moment, which is designed for the LACs and NDIS planners, which is part of the ongoing discussion with the agency around employment. So there's a whole bunch of new programs coming. So there's it's almost a watch this space thing, but we'll run out of time getting some of them together because there's a lot of work that goes in developing a program.
And if participants are interested in our online courses, jump on and have a look at the CDERP College. We've got an overview of customised employment there that could be of interest. And we're happy to offer a coupon. It's a $30 overview, and we're happy to offer a $30 coupon so you can access that overview at no cost. And that coupon is just overview. But if you'd like to get in contact with me and discuss anything about the college, we've got a range of micro-credentials on there, as well as our CDERP certified customised employment professional.
Yeah, there is another program coming next year that some of the providers has asked us if we could develop, and that was around certifying the providers as customised employment providers who are doing it with Fidelity, the model. That's coming, and that'll pop out in the marketplace in the not too distant future. The slide I've just changed to, if you want to have a look at the WorkFirst website, there's some more details around the different programs that we've been involving that'll give you a bit more background to both the inclusive corporations, the individual, and the mental health services. The mental health services actually is evolving very quickly to also include other allied health services within that model. What I might say is one of the things that we're doing within the WorkFirst, particularly with working with schools and kids in schools, is we have a partnership with the Beach Center at the University of Kansas, where we use the self-determination frameworks. That's a great partnership, allows us to use some very good tools which we bring into our discovery work, customised employment work. And for kids that are still in school, we're using the learning model, which is a brilliant tool to take an individual along a learning journey, so when they finish school they have a defined career pathway. So there's some really exciting stuff going on there.
Great. Well, we haven't had any more questions come through, so I think we'll allow a little bit of time at the end if you want to download the 2 files that are in the file section. But I think we're happy to finish up unless there's any final questions. Thank you, Peter, for today's presentation.
Not a problem. Thanks, John. Much appreciated. Thank you, everyone, for your time. Hopefully I didn't sort of get too distracted by Zoom land. Thank you.
Thank you.